Welcome back, everybody, to another week of Thursday's Theology. My name is Jeff, and I'm your host. Thank you for joining us for this first installment. We talked about the intro last week, but oh, sweet, a silver frog. Look at that. Sorry about that. Um, so this week we're officially kicking off our study on the parables of Jesus. And to begin with, we're actually going to look at kind of a strange one, and strange in the sense of when I first heard it when I was growing up, I had no idea what the heck it was about. But again, as I've grown up and kind of matured and studied it more, I kind of realized what's going on here. And the parable we're going to be covering today is called the parable of the wineskin. And it's actually two small parables. It's the parable of the wineskin, and then it's also, there's a story about a patch, a new patch on old cloth, which we'll get into in a second. But the parable of the wineskin, the version that we're going to be looking at least, is found in Luke chapter 5. And in Luke chapter 5, there's a little bit of context that we need to understand for why this parable is applicable and why it's being used at this specific time. But before we begin, last week we talked about how there are 7 major categories of parable, and what I want to try and do is I want to try and take every parable that we're going to be covering and kind of put it into those categories so that you have an idea of what's kind of being talked about and what the parable is about. So the parable of the wineskin kind of covers 2 different categories, I guess. One is the sinner parables, which we talked about, and then 2, it's the preparedness parables. And the reason being is because there's implications for what it means to not be prepared for the new understanding and new concept of who God is. So again, we'll get into that in a second. But all that to say, we have a sinner parable and we have a preparedness parable all wrapped up into this wineskin. So again, this parable takes place in Luke chapter 5. And what is going on here is it's pretty early on in Jesus' ministry, and he is going around Galilee, and he's calling disciples, and he happens to stumble upon this tax collector's booth. Now, I know I've mentioned it before, but I think it's worth mentioning again that the dynamic between Jewish people and Roman tax collectors is very, very interesting, and it adds a lot of depth to what we're talking about. Now, what happens was that Rome was the occupying oppressive force in Judea and Galilee. So what would happen was, instead of Roman soldiers or Roman officials being the one to collect taxes, they would often appoint a local person to collect taxes from the local people. So in this case, they would appoint local Jewish people to collect taxes from other Jews. Now, the reason why this is oh, well, I guess I blew myself up there. The reason why this is important to cover is because this particular tax collector that Jesus comes across is a Jewish man who's been appointed by Rome to collect taxes. Now, the reason why there's so much animosity between Jews and tax collectors is because what would happen is that the tax collectors would be given free range to charge whatever they wanted over what Rome required. So, for instance, if Rome's tax was $20, a tax collector could say, okay, I'm going to charge this person $30, $40, $50, $60, and I'm going to send the 20 to Rome, and then I'm going to pocket the rest. So tax collectors were notoriously corrupt and notoriously greedy, so they were not seen very kindly by Jewish people. So that kind of, remember that context as we go forward. So Jesus goes up to this tax booth, and they would often line the roads to and from different cities to collect taxes from the travelers. Jesus comes up to this tax booth to a guy named Levi, who is also named Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is written by this guy. So Levi is sitting at this tax booth, and Jesus says, "Come and follow me." And Levi, aka Matthew, gets up from his booth and follows Jesus. Now, what happens next is that Matthew throws a giant feast, a banquet for Jesus in his own home. So what Levi does is he invites Jesus over to eat, and then he invites all of his friends. Now, the problem is that a lot of Matthew's/Levi's friends are fellow tax collectors. So it doesn't really make sense to see this parable and be like, oh, well, he just invited, religious people. No. He invited all of his colleagues and friends who are fellow tax collectors. So what happens is that when the feast starts, you have Jesus and his disciples and a bunch of tax collectors and quote unquote sinners. Now, sinners, according to this passage, are those people who of ill repute, tax collectors included. So that's actually a point of contention, because not only do the tax collectors and sinners show up to this party, but some Pharisees and religious leaders also show up to the party. And this is where things start to get really interesting. So the first thing that the Pharisees notice and launch a complaint against Jesus' disciples is that his disciples aren't fasting and praying. Sorry about that noise. And why this is important is because the Pharisees are trying to discredit Jesus and his disciples. So they go up to his disciples. They don't even go and approach Jesus. They go up to his disciples and say, well, John the Baptist's disciples, they feast, or they fast and they pray. Why aren't you guys fasting and praying? Now, this is within earshot of Jesus, because Jesus responds to them by saying, why would my disciples fast? I'm here. It's a time for feasting. It's not a time for fasting. He says that it doesn't make any sense for people not to feast when the bridegroom is present. So the role of Jesus as bridegroom and the role of his church as the bride has a lot of kingdom overtones, and we're going to cover that in some of the upcoming episodes of the parables, because kingdom parables deal specifically with this metaphor of marriage. But all that to say, what Jesus is saying here is that my disciples have no reason to fast because I, the bridegroom, am here, and there's no reason to not celebrate. So the Pharisees are kind of taken aback a little bit by this, and they regroup, and they launch another complaint at Jesus, and that is, they say the Pharisees attack Jesus' disciples. Are like, oh, you're not fasting or praying. And then they say, well, why is it that you're dining with tax collectors and sinners? So the Pharisees look around, they see who Jesus is keeping company with, and they decide to ask, like, well, why is it that you're keeping company with sinners and tax collectors? And Jesus responds, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. So again, he kind of answers the Pharisees by saying, look, I'm here for these people. I'm here to spread God's message to them. And then he launches into the parable of the patch and the wineskin. So basically what happens is that Jesus says, you don't take a new cloth, cut a piece of fabric out of it, and then try to patch an old piece of cloth. Because what you do is you ruin the new cloth because you've cut a piece out of it, and then you ruin the old cloth because the new cloth will tear apart from it. So he says it doesn't make sense to take new cloth and patch an old cloth with it. And then he goes into the parable of the wineskin, and the wineskin basically says, you do not put new wine into old wineskins, because what happens is it bursts and you ruin the new wine. So what's going on here is that in this culture, wineskins were normally leather bags that you put wine into. And what happens with the fermentation process is it produces gas, and it would expand the wineskin. Now, if you take new wine and put it into an old wineskin had already become tough and inflexible. So if you put new wine into old wineskin, the fermentation process, the gas that's created will burst the wineskin because it's rigid, it's inflexible. So what's going on here is that this parable of the patch and the parable of the wineskin is actually Jesus saying to the Pharisees and to his audience that there is a new understanding of who God is. There's a new perception of the kingdom of God, that if you are sticking to your old sense of who God is and your rigid law, you're not going to be able to understand it. You're going to burst. I used this example with my students when I explained this one time of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. At the end of the movie, when they open the Ark, there's one of the Nazis who are there. His head explodes. And for some reason, I've always equated that with a wineskin bursting. I know it's a funny comparison, but I think it's awesome because I love Indiana Jones. But what's going on here is that Jesus is saying to the Pharisees that there's a new perception of the kingdom of God. There's a new understanding of who God is. And if you're stuck in your old rigid understandings of the law, then you're going to miss what's going on here in the present. So this is where it kind of gets into the preparedness, because Jesus is basically saying you have to be prepared to understand and expand with this new understanding of God. Because if you don't, it's gonna it's going to burst. The old patch, the old cloth is going to tear. You're going to ruin the new cloth. You're going to burst the old wineskin and ruin the new wine. So basically, if you're inflexible and unable to expand with this new teaching, this new understanding, then you're going to ruin both the old and the new. So it's a very, very subversive parable, and Jesus is implicating the inability of people to expand and be flexible with this new understanding of who God is. So all that to say, that's the parable of the patch and the wineskin found in Luke 5. I really enjoy talking about it. I really enjoyed studying these parables, so thank you for joining me on this first one. So that being said, now it's time for this week's obscure Bible verse of the week. And this, we're actually going to stick with the Gospel of Luke. And the reason being is because in Luke chapter 9, verse 33, we have what's called the Transfiguration. And the Transfiguration is basically Jesus reveals his divinity to John, James, Peter, James, and John. Yeah, Peter, James, and John. And Moses and Elijah show up. So this is Luke chapter 9, verse 33. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And Luke notes he did not know what he was saying. So Peter had no idea what he was saying. So that is Luke chapter 9, verse 33. So again, thanks for joining us this week for this episode of Thursday's Theology. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It's simply the study of who God is. Take care, and we'll see you next week.